Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to follow up on the video I posted Monday, and this might be categorized under my Words That Fudge series because I want to talk about religion and how we use this word and how difficult this word to use is. Now, the most common way we tend to use this word was heard on the Joe Rogan Experience with Andrew Doyle when he talked about Titania McGrath, who is his Twitter character. A religion is something that people believe. Atheists will often say supernatural stories or stories with elements that are without evidence. Something religious that people do, like going to church or going to synagogue or a mosque or a temple or a shrine. They pray, they give money, they give offerings. Now, in this conceptualization, religion is separate from what we would imagine regular life. And those of you who've been following my videos will probably see Tom Holland coming down the road in this, that there's the seculum. That's sort of normal life down here below where everything is played out. You can find it in the book of Ecclesiastes, in the refrain, under the sun. It seems to be the mundane things that we do, and then religious are these other things, maybe these spiritual things. And this word spiritual, a very fudgy word, just tends to come in and out. And I'll often pause people when I hear them use that word spiritual if the setting allows it. Ask them what they mean by that word, and you very quickly find people stumbling around. They don't know what they mean by spiritual. It's as John McWhorter says in one video that I play quite a bit. There might be a soundtrack to it, but they can't define it. They can't talk about it. But they all use the word, and everyone seems to know what we're saying or know approximately what we're saying when we use it. But there it is. So a religion is one of these things like Christianity and Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism or all of these things. Now, what was interesting again about the Joe Rogan Experience and Andrew Doyle is that they kept talking about woke religion. That was the title of it, because Titania McGrath is a character on YouTube who is more woke than anyone else. Well, what do I mean by woke? That's sort of this ascendant morality of ardent social justice demands being played out in the country. Now, social justice is a word that has been around, a concept that's been around a long time. It's just been in the last few years. It's become polemic in many ways. And so Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle, neither of whom consider themselves to be religious. They don't go to church. If you would ask them, do you believe in God? They would say no. They would call themselves an atheist or perhaps an agnostic. So they would be, in the conceptualization of today, would be regular people. They wouldn't be religious people. Now, again, those of you who have been following Tom Holland and that part of the conversation know that, especially in religious communities, a religious person might be a monk or a nun or a priest or a pastor. A non-religious person might have a secular vocation. They might be a car salesman or a state worker or a mechanic or a plumber or a manager of an AM/PM or something like that. So you've got all of these separations between the natural and the supernatural, the mundane and the spiritual, the secular and the religious. Now, what's been happening with the whole woke religion conversation is that many of these, as Joe Rogan makes, I'm not going to play any videos during this video just so that the sound will be a little bit better, because I've given you some videos lately that there have been some sound issues with. Joe Rogan, says basically, well, there's a lot of atheist people. In fact, most of these people are atheist. And Andrew Doyle jumps in and says, yeah, that's, Tom Holland. He read Dominion, Tom Holland. And it seems that this new woke stuff is sort of becoming people's religion. And then Joe Rogan continues on. In fact, through the whole podcast, I didn't actually finish the podcast until after I made that video that I posted on Monday. But I listened to the entire podcast, and they talk about it pretty much through the whole thing. And part of what I get from that is, I think especially for Joe Rogan, this talking this stuff out is a way that he's thinking through it, and you can very much see the impact that Jordan Peterson has had on him. And what you can see in Joe Rogan is that the definition of the word religion is changing. Religion used to be that thing that other people do out there, Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists. Those are religious things that people do, but I am not religious. I don't go to church. I don't believe in God. I don't pray. I don't do any of these things. My life is regular and normal, and religion is this add-on. And if you listen to someone like Jesse Ventura, religion is this add-on that people do if they need a little bit of help. It might have a therapeutic function. I mentioned in the conversation that I just posted today, and again, there were some sound issues with that, apparently with Stefan's mic. There's these, religion is this other thing that we do, but regular normal life just happens sort of without religion. Now, with the woke stuff, this is causing a problem with this conceptualization because the woke people seem to believe in non-scientific things. In fact, they're sort of anti-science, and math is white supremacist and STEM is white supremacist, and so you have all of this going on, and for this reason, a lot of the modernists in our midst, especially some of the modernist celebrity atheists, but also others, have sort of risen up and said, no, wait a minute, we need to hang on to modernism with this monarchical vision of imagining we're seeing a world of science, and so you sort of had modernist enlightenment rearing up to battle the new ascendant woke morality and the new woke conceptualizations. We hire people because of their skin color rather than their performance within a particular field. But now again, that these conceptualizations have fairly distinct groups, okay, and fairly distinct and hard lines around these things. But now the woke ascendant morality also has a vision for an ideal future, and that ideal future, racism would be no more, and yeah, so they articulate an ideal future. So these people have an ideal future. They have a vision for the way things should be. They seem to have something of a political project. If you watch Benjamin Boyce, you'll notice that they don't really seem to have much in terms of things they can point to that they build. It's usually sort of we're going to disrupt the patterns of heteronormity and white supremacy and all of these things. We're going to disrupt those institutions, but it's unclear if they can actually build their own institutions. And so there's a sort of a naivete naturalism about it. And again, as Joe Rogan said, well, they're often atheists, and Joe Rogan is sort of figuring this out as you listen to him talk, filling this religious hole. But overriding the whole conversation is we can dismiss these people because they are religious. And this is an adaptation of, let's say, new atheist talking points, that you don't have to take religious people seriously because religious people are under the spell of these myths. They believe things without evidence, yada, yada, yada. So that particular episode of the Joe Rogan Experience was, in fact, full of this. And the line of demarcation that you'll find modernist celebrity atheists usually use is natural and supernatural. Now, if you listen to Alistair McGrath and his conversation with Brett Weinstein, early on, Alistair doesn't really say a whole lot of things, but one of the key points he makes early on is that if you're paying attention to conceptualization in words, you'll notice that the word supernatural is really a fairly new thing. It's a relatively modern distinction. Now, modern people can't help but see it. In fact, they see it, well, this is natural, this is supernatural. And so, here are the laws of physics, and things that break the laws of physics are natural, and things that don't break the laws of physics or the things that break the laws of physics are supernatural, and the things that don't break the laws of physics are natural. And difficulties arise, however, when you begin to realize that so much of our daily life in the manifest image don't really follow laws of physics. And so over the last 100 years or so, there's been a concerted effort to try to penetrate humanity with science, psychology, sociology, cognitive science. Let's understand ourselves with science. And of course, the hope behind that is always, well, if we can understand ourselves, then we can control ourselves and we can deliver to ourselves the outcomes that we want, but you always have the problem of who's actually driving that vision, who's actually driving that mission. What us is it that self-transcends and wants to colonize the same us? I mean, it's this sort of self-colonization. And that gets a little weird. So the supernatural distinction can get problematic. And again, with the example of woke religion doesn't necessarily involve the supernatural. They're talking about changing society. In many ways, people are sort of these blank slates. And so given enough time and given enough political power and given enough things, like, say, if you have a newborn baby, don't give that baby a name that would be easily recognized as a boy or a girl, like Bobby or Susan. Give them a gender-neutral name and try to raise them without any gender roles. And there are a bunch of people now. I'm increasingly bumping into more and more of them in my regular life, not just seeing them, in the navigating stars and the Hollywood celestial realm. But the idea is that, well, people are formed, and so we can form them. We can form sin out of them more easily than we can reform anything. And it was Andrew Doyle made a couple of very interesting comments in that Joe Rogan Experience. He says, people always keep imagining that if we just get rid of old people, then the world will be better. What they don't realize is that we keep making old people. It should be your aspiration to grow old someday. Maybe not to grow bald or wrinkly or weak, but at least to live long. So woke religion doesn't necessarily involve the supernatural. But again, Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle look at it and say, well, that's religion, and therefore we can sort of dismiss it. And if you look at my conversation with James Lindsay, woke religion seems to have grown out of Atheism Plus and a bunch of those episodes that happened where we want atheism plus an end to misogyny, the famous elevator incident. We want atheism plus an end to racism. We want atheism plus so on and so forth. And none of this requires anything supernatural. So again, what we see happening with Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle is that the definition of religion, even among people who have been fairly anti-Christian and anti-religious, the definition of religion is changing. They still consider religion to be sort of a bad thing. One of the things that comes up in Joe Rogan's podcast with Andrew Doyle is how often they relegate and associate the religious with the stupid or the idiots or people with low IQ or people that aren't that smart or people that aren't that informed. Again, if you look at a guy like Alistair McGrath, you're really hard-pressed to imagine that this guy he's got multiple PhDs, he teaches at Oxford, really hard-pressed to imagine that this guy is not well-informed or not intelligent or anything like that. And in many respects, people who make those facile associations with religious people, they themselves just haven't gotten out much and met too many really smart religious people. Now, I want to offer a second definition. So the first definition was sort of normal religion, a religion that you can find in the vernacular. This is a religion. Christianity is a religion. Judaism is a religion. And the conceptualization is that you can have this unreligious life, and then religion is sort of this add-on. It can be an add-on because you're mentally weak. It can be an add-on because you're hurt or frightened for some reason, and it's therapeutic. I'd like to offer a second definition of religion, that religion as human authoring program. Now, some of you might remember Jordan Peterson's self-authoring program. He talked it up quite a bit when we were in the Jordan Peterson Phenomenon Chapter 1, which is October 2016, really to June 2019. So Jordan Peterson had a self-authoring program, and what he basically said was sit down and write the future you want to achieve, and sit down and write and envision the future you want to avoid. And he said if you do this, what you will begin to do is begin to realize that, well, you want your life to become something and not another thing. And you'll be motivated by the attraction of the good thing and motivated by the repellent nature of the bad stuff you're running away from. So you can author your life. And again, if you've been watching my videos for a long time, one way to talk about a human being is that we are a story. This is sort of maps onto the two mythology world, where the story that is Paul VanderKlay doesn't age. The body that is Paul VanderKlay does age. The story that is Paul VanderKlay has a very selective telling of information, and identity, all of these things. That story is not material. I could write that story down or talk about that story on a video, but the story itself is immaterial. It is, as we might dare use the word, spiritual. But my body is physical and material. And so when we self-author, do a self-authoring program, and we're, in a sense, writing a story, we are writing our own story, and we are creating ourselves. And obviously, if you're in therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or different sorts of other therapy, you're trying to re-author your life. And you can find a lot of self-help books that promise a similar thing. And this stuff works to one degree or another, because we are stories. And so if you, in a sense, again, self-transcend, you always have to ask, well, who's rewriting the story on whom? I'm rewriting my own story, so I'm on both sides of it. So you got to think deeply about that. But so I'm going to rewrite myself. Well, religion is very much the same process. And this is a good way to conceive of what a religion is and does implicitly, individually, and communally. Many religions, like Christianity, have at its heart a person that everyone strives to be like. Maybe if you're a Christian, if you're a Christian, you strive to be like Jesus. You strive to rewrite your story as, what would Jesus do? A little plastic armband. If you're of another religion, there might be a hero. You might desire to achieve enlightenment like the Buddha, or you might strive to be close to God and live a moral life and be humble like Moses, or you might strive to live a life in full submission to God like Muhammad. So religions are in many ways self-authoring programs, but they're communal. And secular people naturally do this too. They might do it more implicitly, but they get attracted to ideas and images and figures and archetypes. You'll hear Joe Rogan use that word archetype a number of times. Yesterday in my conversation with Boyo Steph, similar thing, used archetype quite a bit. An archetype is sort of a way of pointing to a story or an image or a vision that pulls us into itself. We are attracted to the beauty or the courage or the virtue, some element of that story or image or archetype, and we're drawn to it. You have things you wish to personally and communally achieve, preserve, and avoid. And this is a little business trick, achieve, preserve, avoid, APA. When Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle are talking about this, they're concerned that the new woke religion will destroy the context in which comics are thriving. And it's not just a mercenary thing. They understand the role of comics for a healthy society, that comics offer critique in what they do. And so they're concerned about that. They want to achieve, well, what would they like to achieve? Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle both have images of what a better society would look like. And when you start asking questions like this, many of those answers are far across the board in terms of different religious people. We don't want children to be sick. We don't want people to be hungry. We don't want injustice. Now, how we go on to define justice might be difficult. And when we get particular about who should do what, well, who should be president, or who should be in the Supreme Court, or who should have influence, or whose books we should read. So right away you can begin to see it differentiate. But again, religion is a human authoring program. And if you understand religion in that way, most of us have some sort of human authoring program. Pretty much anybody who's out there blogging or talking on YouTube or working in politics, almost every type of interchange where there's any type of caring or earnestness, there's an attempt at human authoring. We want to author a better humanity. We want to author a better world. You'll hear this talked about all the time in just about any forum you look at. You have in this mechanisms and interfaces in service of this pursuit. All right, and this is where things get political because, again, politics is now and religion is always. And if you understand religion as human authoring, you will see that, well, part of the authoring is going to involve politics, and part of the authoring is going to involve habits and achievements and strivings and learnings, and all of the things that human beings do are pointed towards something. Now, politics usually offers short-term gains. We want lower taxes and more money in our pocket, and to keep the coronavirus at bay, and to have government stay out of our lives when we don't want it in our lives, or have government give us a hand up or a leg up or a little bit of help when we need help, and that government would help the poor, or one way or another there's a mechanism, and that these short-term gains are associated with long-term visions and virtues. Now, what we've seen over the last little while is new atheism breaking down, and Jordan Peterson has had a big part of this. I've mentioned this video quite a bit. Is Sam Harris losing his audience to Jordan Peterson? And I've been tempted to do a couple of videos, or at least a video on Mouthy Buddha, because in many ways his YouTube channel illustrates a certain element of the Jordan Peterson community, and Mouthy Buddha nicely illustrates how he had really bought the Sam Harris thing and was investing, looking into meditation and trying psychedelics and all of this. Well, it's sort of funny that Sam Harris's admonishing people to meditate and do psychedelics is in many ways leading them out beyond Sam Harris. And so what has sort of been happening to this point of new atheism, and the reason it's breaking down, is that there's a more sophisticated view of human nature, of history, of psychology, that are undermining the old, rather strong-mannish critique of religion as superstitious made-up stories. People are beginning to understand, and I think the engagement between Sam Harris and Joe Rogan, people who are politically progressive, although right now they're not as progressive as many, but they're, Joe Rogan is no moral majority conservative by any means. But these people are beginning to notice that this old articulation of what religion is really breaking down. And Jordan Peterson sort of stepped in and illustrated that in a powerful way, a way that got the attention of many, many people. And you begin to realize that these atheists, who are, even their attempt to get religion out of politics or condemn religious behaviors that they find are problematic, atheists themselves are working a human authoring program. And they're very upfront about it. They want to improve the world. Now, if you ask them, how do they know if the specific things that they are admonishing are in fact improvements? It's a little tougher to say, but that's their project too. So in that sense, atheists are religious too. Now, Jordan Peterson really entered in as a Jungian, and I know there's a lot of debate. How faithful of a Jungian was Jordan Peterson? Was Jordan Peterson promoting a sort of vision of Jung that was unfaithful to Jung? And I'm going to leave that to those who know far more about Carl Jung than I ever will. But Carl Jung, I think, made a significant contribution really over and against Freud, that religion is a dream or a story that we're always embedded within. That's a powerful argument. I was just thinking the other day what strange creatures we are. I was waking up in the morning and I was thinking about a couple of dreams that I had, and I was thinking about my conversations with Dr. James Frazee, who comes to the meetup, about his ideas about dreams. We're very, very strange creatures in that we've always got these stories seemingly going through our head. And, well, maybe in meditation you can work on sort of shutting the whole thing down. But at night, we have these dreams. And where do these dreams come from? And Jordan Peterson talking about the fact that where does the information in the dreams come from? And we recognize that the conscious self that is talking to you right now is just one small business of this whole consciousness congress that is in my head. The human authoring project is best represented as a story because we, in many ways, see ourselves and represent ourselves and each other as stories. In fact, we represent governments as stories. We represent history as stories. And they're sort of chaotic like dreams. In fact, unless we write them down or really try to, devote them to a degree of rigor, such as trying to put it into a play or into a movie or something like that, the stories are rather chaotic and haphazard, sort of like dreams are. Not nearly as chaotic as dreams usually, but we all have this funny experience when we're dreaming that things seem to make sense in the dream, and then when we wake up and try to write it down or talk about it, we recognize that this stuff doesn't make any sense. Am I that person, or was I me, or who was this person, or was this person another person? I mean, our dreams are just sort of like that. But we recognize that stories are the most powerful human representations we have in many ways. Is it more powerful than science? Well, I think we regularly colonize science with our stories. We regularly colonize science with our human authoring program. Science is sort of neutral out there, waiting for an agent to come along and put their hands around it and push it in a direction. So, stories, as Vervaeke recognizes, are psychotechnologies that we teach each other how to do. And I was talking about that with John, and he's mentioned it in some of his other videos, that we learn to represent ourselves as stories. And we learn to represent our world in story form. These are things that we learn to do. And again, you are a story. I am a story. And this is in some ways one of the splits in terms of the axial age mythology, that in many ways the story that I imagine to be is eternal and imagines itself go on living forever and ever as a story, whereas I know that my body is decaying and aging, and someday my family will put my body in a box and put me in the grave. So you are a story, but we're this weird beings that are connected between heaven and earth. And we consume them constantly, Netflix and movies and HBO and just on and on and on, books and art. We just consume representations, and especially stories. We love them. They're in some ways, when I say they're the machine code, they're our machine code. John says, well, don't forget that's learned behavior. Yeah, it is, but it very much is our machine code in terms of, I think, how we conceptualize ourselves, how we conceptualize our relationships with each other, even how we conceptualize ourselves in community. And what changes between cultures and religion is many ways the interface. There was a very interesting portion in Brett Weinstein's conversation with Sam Harris about this, where they brought up Don Hoffman, and Sam was talking about the fact that he was quite interested in this sort of interface idea of reality. And in my conversation with Carl Gruner, Carl was pretty hard on this, but I agree with what Brett says in terms of there's sort of an obviousness to this. How do I know that the green that I experience is the same experience that someone else has, or the blue? By virtue of the fact that our eyes can only pick up certain wavelengths and our ears can only pick up certain frequencies, and that we know via science that there are many other things going on in this world. For example, this computer is connected to the internet via a Wi-Fi connection. So the router is over there and the computer is here, and somehow there's a connection between this computer. So there's electromagnetic radiation that we're not seeing. There's the infrared spectrum of light that we're not seeing, we're not hearing, ultrasonic noise. So in that sense, what we have around us is an interface, and we're manipulating that interface. And what I would argue is that religions are in that too. Religions are vast, complex constructs by which we attempt to interact with the rest of the world. And I would argue that materialism, modernism, science is also a construct by which we try to interact with the world. Now, many people have sort of a naive perspective on it, say, no, when I'm picking up the cell phone stand, well, I'm just picking up the cell phone stand. And in one way, that's right. It's a very durable interface. But again, if you delve into physics at all, you know that there's more space than particle in terms of the atoms in what feels to me to be a very hard cell phone stand. And the same with my skin. And then if you get down to the wave layer, they imagine that these particles are actually being created by waves. And it's like, wow, physics gets very, very weird, even though the interface level for me and this cell phone stand is very durable. It's very reliable. It works very well. If I hit myself in the head with this cell phone stand, I'll feel a little bit of pain in my head. So, but he said, well, this is an interface, and in many ways, it's difficult for us to get beyond the interface. Now, physics in that sense is also an interface, and you can use physics and chemistry and biology. These are all different conceptualizations, all different ways at interfacing the physical world, the world of physics around us. But similarly, religion, culture, these are all ways of interfacing the storyverse and the stories around us. I am articulating. I am trying to change your mind. I am trying to change the world beyond me. When people of influence and power speak, the ideas that they have, and again, these ideas are not physical, these ideas go out and change the physical world. These ideas colonize the physical world. When John F. Kennedy said he wanted to put a man on the moon, that moved an entire generation to achieve the Apollo 11 moonshot. In other words, the ideas colonize the matterverse. The storyverse colonizes the matterverse. And as, again, Carl Jung says, that Jordan Peterson reminds us, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And we regularly find this. And so religion as human authoring is ideas having people. Now, secularism basically says, well, this particular language, these particular conceptualizations of whatever they are, without supernatural stories, these are foundational. These are the real story. If you talk to religious people who have other stories, they'll say, no, these stories are the real stories. You can read Kuhn's scientific history of scientific revolutions and understand that, in fact, all of our scientific stories themselves undergo idea revolutions, and that the Newtonian conception of physics is displaced, not fully, but in many ways by relativity. And so you see all of these displacements. The heliocentric displaces the Earth at the center of the universe. And so you can read C.S. Lewis's Discarded Image. So even the sciences that we have are conceptualized as stories, and even those go through revolutions. And what's amazing about human beings is that we manage this. We do this. And again, this is part of our amazing capacity to use story to represent the world. They, secularists, individually and communally, work to achieve the goals and desires they consider to be good. And again, that's human authoring. Now again, with this definition of religion as human authoring, well, that's a very broad definition then. It encompasses a good amount of the things that we do. If you go back and listen to some of my conversation with Adam Friended, who runs Think Club and the Adam Friended channel, he is not an anti-theist, but he is an atheist. And he says, well, all of this is true. And what happens is, may the best story win. This is sort of a Darwinian perspective. And he asserts that the reason Nazi Germany lost the war is its story was inferior to the world story told by the Western powers. It may or may not be true. It's a difficult argument to make in short terms, but he would, I think, want to say that this is true over a Darwinian perspective, okay? So we discern the relative truth or falsehood of a religious system, now conceptualizing even secular systems as religious systems, defining a religious system as a human authoring program. So we discern the relative truth or falseness of a religious system, supernatural or not, via its performance throughout history. And this is very Darwinian. And this is where you get the conversation with Brett Weinstein that religion is an adaptive system, that communities with better religion outperform and outcompete communities that have worse religion. In other words, it's sort of a Darwinian competition on interface. And even within the subtraction story of secular humanism, you would say the reason, and you could hear Matt Dillahunty or Sam Harris say that, the reason secular humanism is superior to Christianity or these other religions is because they displace them, that you can do things with them that you can't do with these old religions. And this is where you get the idea that religions are antiquated technology. Now, this idea itself has been around far before Darwin. In fact, I would argue that this idea itself is fundamentally religious and has been practiced by people throughout human history within the religious spectrum, long before the Enlightenment or the Protestant Reformation or anything like this. And it's because it's conceptualized not via sort of Darwinian language about groups competing against their rivals to displace them, but it's really conceptualized through, in religious terms, the idea of God's will. What you can find around us, well, that which is clearly what God wants to be, so therefore it's God's will. The winners are chosen by God. And you can find these ideas in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam. Now, what I want you to see again is that this Darwinian idea of the group with the best interface, the group with the best story, outcompetes the other group. And we're going to talk a little bit about the metadivine realm, an impersonal universe. In a personal theistic universe, the winning is affirmed and seen as the approval of God. You can find this in the Bible. You can find this broadly within religion. In fact, it's at the basis of every conceptualization of an ordeal. Those of you who have listened to my church channel or some of my sermons and my Sunday school lesson will know that baptism is a ritualized ordeal. There are a bunch of ordeals in the biblical book of Daniel, where, the beginning of the book is an ordeal where Daniel will not eat the food from the king's table. He wants vegetables and water, whereas everyone else is getting the rich food of the palace. But Daniel and his friends, who are keeping kosher, as it were, through water and vegetables, well, they show themselves to be far superior to the others who are eating from the king's table, to the degree that the steward takes away the meat from everyone else, and everybody gets to go on the Daniel diet. I don't know if they were happy about that. I sure wouldn't be. A little bit later on in the book of Daniel, you have the story of the fiery furnace, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are given Babylonian names, are thrown into the fiery furnace. But when Nebuchadnezzar looks into the fiery furnace, he sees 4 people walking around, and one of them looks like a son of the gods. And then he calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out of the fiery furnace, and they do. And whereas the guards who threw them in there, the furnace was so hot that the guards died, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they don't even smell like smoke. Their hair isn't even singed. This is what's behind an ordeal. This is history reveals the judgment of the gods. A little bit later in the book, Daniel is thrown into a lion's den, and the lions don't do anything to Daniel. God protected Daniel, and this is the sense that God picks the winners. If there's a winner out there, well, they're picked by God. Now, if you go back in my videos and you ask me about God number 1 and God number 2, this is very much God number 1. This is the God of this is the God of historical outcomes. And you will find this, again, on and on. I've been trying to read as many of Tom Holland's books as I can, and I'm currently in the shadow of the sword, realizing that a lot of the good ideas in Dominion were also in the shadow of the sword, that he's been working these ideas for a while. But in this book, he talks about basically the Christian story, the fact that Christianity outcompeted paganism for supremacy in the Roman Empire. He notes, winners were the favorites of heaven. Even Christians whose God had died as a convicted criminal, nailed to a wooden cross, might succumb to this presumption. This is, in fact, the presumption that's at the heart of the book of Job. Eusebius, the first great Christian historian, certainly took it for granted. How could he not have done? How could he not have done when he had the spectacle before him of a Roman state that for centuries had been gore-streaked with Christian blood, miraculously transformed into a bulwark of the church? Now, a little bit later on in this book, Islam will use the same argumentation. Of course Islam is true. Look at how Islam ate the church in the East and almost ate the church in the West. God, by definition, is the winner and always on the winning side. And so the winners in history are those favored by God. Now, if you look again at Adam's argument about Nazi Germany and ancient arguments about God, they're basically the same argument. The group that has the best interface, the group that has the best handle on the truth, the group that has the best conceptualization, usually represented in story form, this group will win. The one who could predict the collapse of the housing market and the economy in 2008, well, right, watch that movie about Short Sale. Watch the movie about the guy who basically predicted the collapse, and he won bigly. So if in fact you can see through the illusions, if in fact you have a better take on the interface of humanity, if in fact you look at the world more clearly in terms of truth, you ought to be able to succeed and outcompete those around you. That's deep, deep, deep into our conceptualization. It's very old and very basic, and religions have been making this argument for a very long time. History reveals the will of God. Now you'll notice again that because religions have been dealing with this for a long time, they also take into account its dissonance. And you can read that in the book of Job. Now, so another Tom Holland book, Persian Fire, talks about Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was the god of, I believe, the Zoroastrians. And if you look at the Persian Empire, who was ruled by the King of Kings, who had the mightiest and greatest empire around, and Persian Fire is about the war between the Greeks and the Persians. It's a great story, and it's really well told. This is why in the beginning, when Ahura Mazda, greatest of the gods, had summoned time and creation into being, he had engendered Arta, who was truth, to give order to the universe. Without Arta, it would have lacked form and beauty, and the great cycles of existence set in motion by Lord Mazda could not have brought life into the world. And some of you reading this will say, ooh, this kind of sounds like Genesis and the creation story. Even so, the work of truth, capital T, was never done. Just as fire, when it rises to the heavens, is accompanied by black smoke. If you look on my church channel, one of the most popular video on that channel is an old one I did before I ever started doing this, about how altars work in the ancient conceptualization. Such as fire, when it rises to the heavens, is accompanied by black smoke. So Arta, the Persians knew, was shadowed by Drauga, the lie. Two orders, one of perfection, the other of falsehood, each the image of the other, were coiled in a conflict as ancient as time. And so here you have a religious representation of the world that is the truth and the lie, and you always want to be on the side of truth. And so the king of kings, the king of Persia, will go out and fight the lie wherever he finds it. And so he's going to bring the truth to the Greek city-states. He's going to bring the truth to all the nations of the world. He's going to bring the truth because this is what Ahura Mazda, his great god, wants to bring to the world. This is a religious conceptualization. This is a human authoring program. Now it's conceptualized in story form, and it's propagated through history, and it moves throughout all of the decisions of the great Persian emperors, of Cyrus, of Darius, of Xerxes, of Artaxerxes, on and on and on. It's the conceptualization that is moving history, and they want to be on the side of truth, not the side of the lie. Now, if we abstract it away from these religious stories, again, showing our modern bias, if I talk about truth and lie, then even the secularists will say, oh, yes. And then the religious people will map then their gods onto the truth and the lie. So you have God and Satan and on and on. So again, you're thinking of religions as interfaces through which we try to get a handle on the world. And we imagine that the better religion will, in fact, outcompete the lesser religions, just as the better conceptualizations of science, storified paradigms that we read in Thomas Kuhn, History of Scientific Revolutions, will outcompete the other older paradigms. But at the same time, we also are a little bit transcendent above those different stories, and so we'll say we'll continue to use Newtonian mechanics in certain time frames or in certain scales. We'll also use relativity and other forms of physics in other scales. In other words, we ourselves transcend these different stories and implement them as we see as relevant. All right. This also works in highly Darwinian religious stories without God. And I did a couple of videos on Hitler's religion and on Timothy Snyder's Black Earth. And their argument would say, hey, we can see the ideal story in nature. If you look at nature, you can discover patterns. And in those patterns, you see that some things outcompete other things. A friend of mine used to like to say, you don't see weak elk. And so the subjection of the weak to the strong, even the consumption of the weak by the strong, is in fact what we see in nature as the bottom line, as real truth. And so obviously in Hitler's conceptualization, these other stories that come along that say, well, the weak have a moral authority, or the weak have a moral privilege above the strong. And again, this is all being played out right now with all this woke conversation. Hitler says, well, the Jew is responsible for the weakening of society. And so what Hitler wanted to do is get all of this abstract conceptualization out of the way so that the strong could do their thing and the herd would be purged of the weak and the infirm, and humanity continue to evolve and go further and further. If you want more details of this, you can go back and look at the videos that I made on this topic. In other words, remove the story verse and let nature take its course. But one of the things that you begin to realize is that you cannot conceptualize even of this project without a story. There's a story implicit in their story, and you really can't get around it if you're talking about other human beings. Now, you might try to represent it in computer code as Donald Hoffman tries to do in terms of pointing to the fact that, we really are tuned into evolutionary tricks, and it's the tricks that outcompete the others, and you have this fly trying to mate with bottles in Australia as the argument. But the way that we colonize each other, the way that ideas get transmitted, is we do them through story. And in fact, another video that I'm thinking about doing talks about how no, I won't give too much of that away. So again, the first definition of religion is sort of this simple, naive definition of religion. Well, Christianity is a religion and Judaism is a religion. I'm not religious, they're religious. And again, you'll hear me use this language because this is part of the language that we have. But it's a rather low-level, naive, simplistic understanding of religion. The second definition of religion I want to offer is religion as human authoring program. And built in that will be certain ends, certain telos, certain conceptualizations of good and evil. Now, the third definition of religion I want to look at is the definition of religion that we get from sociology. And Emil Durkheim was vitally important in this. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. Okay? That is to say, things set apart and surrounded by prohibitions. You can find, in some ways, Philip Reif working the same idea in his book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic. Beliefs and practices that unite its adherents in a single moral community called a church. Now, obviously, he's doing this within Christendom. Church means that church is an English translation of ecclesia, that's what the word in Greek that gets translated as church in the Bible. It's a gathering of people, and so this is sort of a communal way, and so it's a single moral community. That's what a religion is. Now, again, people who would describe themselves with definition 1 as not being religious would also be religious under this because they are operating as a moral community. And again, if you go back and listen to Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle talk about woke religion, they'll notice that, well, to whatever degree you can look at woke religion as a religion, it's a moral community. In a sense, Emil Durkheim says, "Oh, modern observer, you blinded by your own ideology, don't be distracted by the myths, the stories, the gods, etc. Don't be possessed by your subtraction story. Look at what is considered sacred. And if you understand what is considered sacred, the rest of the storied conceptualization will flow out." This is, in a sense, a realization of frames, because if you have something which is considered sacred, that is your highest ideal. Now, in my God number 1 and God number 2 schema that I get from Isaiah 6, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. God is holy. God is sacred. And if you look at the Old Testament Levitical law, there are certain things that are sacred and certain things that are profane. And in fact, the relationship between the sacred and the profane define the worldview, and they shape the moral community. They define what is good and what is not good. This is a sociological approach to religion. And they would say religion isn't this thing out there. Religion is what people do. Religion is how people act. So the first definition, again, religion as a thing. The second definition, religion as a project or a program, a human authoring program. Now the third definition of religion is sacredness that defines one's world. Now, a while ago, I watched a conversation that Benjamin Boyce did with James Lindsay, and I thought that was a very helpful conversation. It was about this time that I was working through the frame stuff. And you can find those videos on my channel. James made the observation that in order for critical race theorists to work and some of these different critical theory communities to work, they all have within their framework something which is sacred. the oppression of them on the basis of race or sex or ability or something else. That's the sacred thing that you can't deconstruct. Because you need something in your system that isn't deconstructed. If you deconstruct everything, you have nothing. You have no basis for action. Again, this is basically a retooling of the Jordan Peterson idea of hierarchy, that you in fact have an implicit hierarchy. You have a moral hierarchy, you have a hierarchy of values, and this hierarchy dictates what you do at any given moment. And this is the interface between this conceptual hierarchy that you have, which in many ways, in all likelihood, you have inherited from your parents, and you've continued to modify by interactions with a community, interactions with the world. You've continued to play with it, but you've got this hierarchy. And at the top of this hierarchy is a sacred thing, a thing you will not deconstruct. It is the thing you are about. Now, again, religion has had this kind of idea for years, and it's very much built into the idea of idolatry. Because in Christianity, the sacred thing is outside the age of decay. It's outside the material world. It's outside the world of change. It's at the absolute top of the hierarchy. It's in heaven, this place that doesn't change. Okay? Now, the moment that you have something within the world, such as money, which itself, again, is not material. This dollar bill is material. This dollar bill is a representation of $1. The moment you have something within the age of decay, within the material world, and you make this the thing that won't be deconstructed, well, now you've created a God. But your God within the material world has a real problem, because that God is now subject to all of the things that can happen in the world. And this is where you get the idea of idolatry. This is also where you connect in with John Vervaeke's idea of signs. And you would say that in some ways this dollar bill is a sacrament to the universe of dollars. All right? It's a representation, but it's not simply a picture or... And this is where you get into these different definitions of the word symbol. So the dollar is in a sense, a sacrament into the world of dollars. Now, where is the world of dollars? Well, many of us are living very dramatically within the world of dollars. Your bank is living in the world of dollars. You buy houses based on the world of dollars. You buy cars based on the world of dollars. You go to work based on the world of dollars. You say, well, where is this world of dollars? This world of dollars is not physical. Now, you might say this world of dollars is intersubjective. Oh, that's true, but it's not purely intersubjective, because I can't just decide, me and you get together and say, let's make $1 million between us, you and me, intersubjectively, and then we'll go put it in the bank. It doesn't work that way. There's another element to this, and so this dollar bill is sort of a sacrament. It connects us to the world of dollars, but there's something in this world of dollars that you don't deconstruct, and that is the dollar itself. And that's the only way that world can work. And this, of course, connects up to the frame problem, because once you make the dollar your frame, the rest of your world sort of falls into line. Once you make something else your frame, you will spend dollars towards it and say, I care about this other thing more than I care about dollars. Making dollars your world, well, anyway, the Bible talks about that plenty. So you need a way to conceptualize the totality. That's God number one. And again, if some of the latter Vervaeke videos about the second self, some of these ideas, Tillich, there's the infinite out there. Now, obviously, we can't, as limited time and space creatures with limited bandwidth in terms of what we can represent and manage in our mind. There's always this place between the finite and the infinite, and of course, Ian McGilchrist's idea about the brain, that the bicameral brain is in fact designed to manage that place between the finite and the infinite. And that's the places that we're always interested in. All right? So you need a way to conceptualize this infinite world, the totality, And a really handy representation of that is, in fact, historically God. God number one is the representation of the infinite. It is being itself, not a being. And that's in a sense where God number two comes in, because when we get into representations of God number two, once we make a representation of the God, we have reduced the God and turned the ground of being into a being. And this is part of the reason in the third commandment, you shall not make any graven image of God. You will not make a representation of God picked from within the things that God has made, because any representation you make of God, well, will be problematic because it doesn't have the quality of the infinite. And there's where Christianity, a whole bunch of, again, religion has been working on this stuff forever, but the interface is different from the interface that we're using in terms of science. So within it is the infinite, that which is too large for you to grasp. And so you boil it down to the greatest thing you can conceive of. And now we're knocking on the ontological argument for the existence of God. And you're knocking on the fact that faithful Jewish communities don't even want to represent God as a word. And they signal that in various ways themselves. And again, if you understand what's going on here, it's actually deeply brilliant and deeply functional. Now, part of what I think happened that turned the page is, in terms of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, was that Sam Harris and the likes kept imagining God number two, not understanding the God number oneness aspect to how this interface has worked throughout human history, and so just simply strawmanned it. And Jordan Peterson pretty much came along and said, he didn't use these words, but said, wait a minute, you're not understanding this interface at all, how it's gone through human history. And again, in my mind, this is the creation of God number one. Now, if you listen to Eric Weinstein and his portal, his first guest was Peter Thiel, who he works for, and just not too, I'd noticed they kept going on about impotence in technology, impotence in markets, impotence in science, that we seem to be stalled lately too. And actually, I got this from 2015. Lately too, David Brooks just did a big, or maybe it was Ross Duthot, talking about this idea of decadence, that in a sense, our culture is stalled. Now, perhaps our culture is stalled because we have lost the handle on some very powerful interfaces that have borne significant fruit in the past. 2015, Ross Duthot talks about Star Wars and decadence. For National Review's 60th anniversary issue last month, instead of my usual movie review, I did a short piece on what Back to the Future Day, the arrival of the day 10/21/2015, to which Marty McFly leapt towards from the Reagan 1980s era in Back to the Future 2, tells us about decadence. Not the decadent drift, stagnation, and repetition as defined by Jacques Barzun. All that is meant by decadence is falling off. The forms of art as of life seem exhausted. The stages of development have been run through. Institutions function painfully. Repetition and frustration are intolerable result. Very interesting that this keeps coming up again and again lately. And I think in some ways it's the communal pair to the meaning crisis. A lostness amid affluence. A lack of motivation. Habits of distraction and escape. A lack of direction, susceptibility to colonization by those with a vision. It's pretty amazing that at the same time Sam Harris was railing against religion, ISIS was forming, made up not of the poor of the Near East, who are not having a meaning crisis, but made up of the middle class Islamic of Europe, who went over to Syria and Iraq to try to create the Islamic State. What does that say about decadence and impotence? Why did they grab after a religious interface with so much zeal, to the degree that they would, many of them, lose their lives or be imprisoned for the rest of their lives and lose a comfy, cushy existence in Europe and see fighting for the Islamic State as an upgrade? What does that say about human beings? What does that say about our era? And when that was happening, many news organizations in the West were kind of scratching their heads at it. They couldn't figure it out. Well, I think this is a part of the same underlying phenomenon that led to the rise of Jordan Peterson. Now, Americans in the English-speaking world, Americans, Canadians, Australians, people in the UK, the Dutch, Germany, they didn't go fight ISIS. They were from Christian backgrounds, but now suddenly Jordan Peterson, doing a biblical series, revives them, and they want to now be the hero. Okay? This is the religious interface. This is defining the sacred. There's an image. There's a human authoring program going on. There's something sacred out there that must be pursued. And suddenly there's drama and there's romance and there's story and there's something worth living for. There's meaning. I think it all is tied together, and it's not an accident. Now, this plays in either the theist or the non-theistic realm. And I talked a little bit with Stefan. Is it Stefan or I don't know? Fox, one of the boyos, about this, that sort of what we have with theism and non-theism are two conceptualizations of the world. But the hero, there's space for heroes in either conceptualization, and they rise. And they rise to try to colonize the world and to be agents in the world. And they're looking for agency in terms of finding their way into it. Now, it's interesting to me that the meaning crisis and, again, I'd say the rise against impotence and decadence spanned this divide between the meta-divine realm and theism, that people have sort of taken both ways up out of it. Again, this realm, you can look at the videos that I've made about this. The meta-divine realm is a conceptualization of the universe as finally fundamentally impersonal, and we are the only agents that are trying to rise within it, as opposed to a theistic conceptualization of the universe that says that there is a God, and in fact our will is to both be like the God, to fulfill the image of God, and in Jesus' case, to be like Jesus. But these are agents looking to make their way. And on the theistic side, subjects looking to be obedient, not just to the dictates and commands, but also to the image of God. God is a creator. Tolkien comes around and says, we are sub-creators. Now, one of the really interesting things that I think came out of the conversation between Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke, the last one, which was interesting because it was quite esoteric on both of their parts, and a lot of people complained about that. Jonathan Peugeot really nailed it when he said the expression of the infinite is equal to the finite. That's essentially what Christianity asserts. That's what the church councils declared. But now part of what divides, so Jonathan Peugeot and I are both theists, and John Vervaeke is non-theist. And so part of what divides us is this overall conceptualization of the universe that John Vervaeke would, and I don't know if he and I haven't really talked about, but the non-theism is sort of this meta-divine realm, that there are rules to the universe, there are ways that the thing works. Materialism is this way, atheism is this way. Theism says at the top of the universe is the ground of being, and the ground of being is personal. Now, how you're going to part of the reason that it's so difficult to argue your way one to the other, both sides put up a lot of arguments, is because we're both using interfaces. And there's a lot of commonality in some ways between them. Again, another one of the key things that I took away from the Jonathan Michaud, John Vervaeke conversation was whether it's personal all the way up and down, or at some point the personal stops and it's impersonal. The way we work up from where we're at in terms of how we're built is personal. And you can look at my conversation that I had with John Vervaeke, God as the Ancient Solution to the Frame Problem, because we use the spirit of finesse, working our way up. When your car stalls, you talk to it. Why? Now, do you imagine that your car can listen to you? Most of us don't, but that's naturally how we talk. When Verizon Lisa hears the universe giving her a smartphone, she talks to the universe. Well, what are you doing when modern people now want to be post-Christian and they want to get away from Christianity because they've got concerns about the morality of Christianity? But what do? They stop saying God and they start saying universe. It's God number one. It's the interface with the universe that by default, and I think this is built into us, by default we approach as personal relationship. Okay? Now, we also have this other mode where we approach it as machine in order to get the things that we want. And again, in Christianity, that's idolatrous. That, if you listen to Tim Keller in kind of the mid-aughts, he would call that religion, and you'll hear that in some of my sermons. We try to work religion in an impersonal world by trying to get from the meta-divine realm the things that we want. And that, in a sense, places us as the thing that won't be deconstructed at the top of the hierarchy. But at the same time, we have in many of our systems that we've inherited from Christianity the understanding that that's a bad thing to do. But my point here is that we talk up as persons to the universe. Actually, we continue to do both ways. And we try to use it as a system. But again, when we deal with each other, we don't like to be treated as systems. We don't like to be dismissed, Bulverisms. We don't like to be, as C.S. Lewis called it, we don't like to be dismissed as simply a hodgepodge of the functions of systems that is fooling us into imagine we are actually persons with agency. Now Protestants have been working these questions of religion for a while now, and it comes into the subtraction story. And I get this from C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. I call it religion advisedly. We who defend Christianity find ourselves constantly opposed not by the irreligion of our hearers, but by their real religion. And this gets into definition number one of, well, I don't have a religion. You have a religion because I don't go to church and I don't believe in God and I don't pray. Well, what religion are they actually working? They're working the religion of human authoring. And they're working, in terms of talking to each other, the religion of sociology. They're trying to discern amongst us a sacred thing so that you and I can collaborate in order to compete, as Brett Weinstein says. Okay? I call it religion advisedly, says C.S. Lewis. We who defend Christianity find ourselves constantly opposed not by the irreligion of our hearers, but by their real religion. Speak about beauty, truth, and goodness, or about a God who is simply the indwelling principle of these things. Speak about a great spiritual force pervading all things, a common mind of which we are all parts, a pool of generalized spirituality to which we can all flow. It's like he wrote Star Wars. And you will command friendly interest. But the temperature drops as soon as you mention a God who has purposes and performs particular actions, who does one thing and not another. A concrete, choosing, commanding, prohibiting God with a determinate character. People become embarrassed or angry. The popular religion excludes miracles because it excludes the living God of Christianity and believes instead in kind of a God who obviously would not do miracles or indeed anything else. Again, this is in some ways the meta-divine realm. So pantheism, God is everything, but there's no agency, there's no choosing, there's no things we associate with persons. And so right here you can see the difference between theism and non-theism and the meta-divine realm. This popular religion may roughly be called pantheism. And there are other forms of it too. And we must now examine its credentials. In the first place, it usually is based on a quite fanciful picture of the history of religion. According to this picture, man starts by inventing spirits to explain natural phenomena. And at first he imagines these spirits to be exactly like himself. I don't know if anybody who believes this actually looks at how spirits were represented across the world in different cultures. Sometimes they look like people, sometimes they look like very different things. As he gets more enlightened, more modern, in other words, they become less man-like, less anthropomorphic, as the scholars call it. Their anthropomorphic attributes drop off one by one. First, the human shape, the human passions, the personality, will, activity. In the end, every concrete or positive attribute, whatever. Oh, that's interesting. They're getting abstracted. All right. There is left in the end a pure abstraction. Mind as such. Spirituality as such. God, instead of being a particular entity with a real character of its own, becomes simply the whole show. Universe. Looked at in a particular way, or the theoretical point at which all the lines of human aspiration would meet if produced to infinity. And since, on the modern view, the final stage of anything is more refined and civilized stage, this is our progressivism that's built in, and inherited from Christianity, this religion is held to be a more profound, more spiritual, and more enlightened belief than Christianity. And C.S. Lewis will go on to talk about that. Now, postmodernity tries not to forget the viewer, because in that vision, the viewer and their filters and their biases are forgotten. Postmodernity, with its hermeneutic of suspicion, wants to weigh in and say, all these meta-narratives are all people making these because they want money or sex or power or status or something. So in the end, no one has in the beginning, no one had a religion. All right? And you see that. In the beginning, nobody had a religion. They just did. They sacrificed animals because that's what, actually, we can read Rene Girard, because they were trying not to kill other people. They sacrificed animals. They did religious things. They went to church. They prayed. They did all these things. But that wasn't a religion. That was the interface that they used to make the world work. People tried to work the world as naive and free of religion as the most ardent atheists. This is what we did. This is what the woke are doing. This is what the materialists are doing. This is what the Christians are doing. This is what the Jews are doing. We're all working this interface in order to make our way through the world. We're priestly chimps banging on puzzle boxes. Watch my last video. And now we arrive at the fourth definition of religion as adaptive culture. People learn to work their boxes, their rituals, not simply for gummy bears, but for human companionship, as status, as favor, as community, as all the things that we needed. And it was built into what it means by being a human being. Again, see Brett Weinstein in that conversation he had with Alistair McGrath, a video, a clip that I've played a lot of different times. That we have two tracks, and these two tracks are what it means to be a human being. We struggle to recognize a human being that isn't in some ways on our cultural page. We don't trust them. We don't like them. We don't believe in them. We don't believe that they have our best future at heart. They'll have to prove it to us. Now again, as I mentioned recently, one of the things that you find about religion is that it's hardly ever mentioned in the Bible. The word religion is barely in most of your English translations of the Bible. One of the few places you can find it is in the book of James. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Well, what do you think? Well, threskia is the Greek word that's being translated here. But what is the conceptualization of religion? It's the interface that makes life work. Now, in the book of James, in a theistic context, this would be to earn favor with God, because God is the conceptualization. If you're in a non-theistic context, or maybe a materialist context, your religion is all of those decisions and practices and habits that you do in order to achieve out of the world for yourself what you want, and for your community what you believe is your good and noble end. Your religious authoring, your human authoring project, okay? So the book of James says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Their religion doesn't work. Now, he's a theist, of course. Religion that God, our Father, accepts as pure and faultless. Oh, now we have a hierarchy. This is what we want to aspire to. Is this: to look after orphans and widows, to look after the weak. Cue Tom Holland and his book Dominion. This is what Christianity says. Comes from the Old Testament as well. That's what's up on the priority, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Well, what on earth do you mean by that? Well, in the context of first century Jerusalem, that might mean resisting Roman influence, resisting pagan influence, because the Romans were occupying and the Romans were doing their religious thing. They were very much trying to be benevolent to the Jews and get them to give up their silly religion with their empty temple and embrace the Roman way that clearly is the best way to live, because again, the gods reveal their favor in the success of the people. Now, James is running a resistance program and saying, be generous to the widows and orphans and don't be polluted by the world. And again, with the Bible, you'd think a religious book would use the word religion more in it, but it doesn't. So the word that James is using here is threskia, which is translated religion or religious or self-made religion in some ways. And this has the background of to tremble or to serve, a therapeutic. This is the idea that, well, this is the fear of something. You recognize, you fear heights because you're afraid to fall. You fear the lion because you know it's stronger than you are. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What is wisdom? Wisdom is your way of navigating the world. Well, fearing the Lord, the ground of all being, you fear the Lord in order to work your way in the Lord. And so what you want is good threskia. You want good religion in order to work in the world with wisdom. This is where we brought in Drew Johnson, and he noted in Japan, which in some ways is a highly secular culture, repeated attempts to try to plant churches in Japan ever since it was crushed out. You can read that in the book Silence, have failed. But when the tsunami hit, they put up a phone booth and people had phone calls to the dead. Now, nobody's saying that the phone booth was a medium, but what was going on in that? We are homo religiosus, okay? We are at heart religious beings. And so he's talking on, the people are making up religion. They're creating rituals. They're working through their stuff in order to survive in the world. And There's this other very interesting video about, are Japanese people religious? Or what do Japanese people think about Christianity? And this on-the-street interview with these two young Japanese millennials, one of them offers up, after he reveals that they don't really know a lot about Shinto or Buddhism, they're just kind of living out there on their own, and then the woman offers up, I do end up praying for help when I'm in a bind. So I think it's okay for God to exist, and it's something important. You have the therapeutic, that moralistic therapeutic deism, that it's God's job to help us when we're in a bind, to get us out of a mess. That's moralistic therapeutic deism. That's a religious system that is in many ways implicit at the folk level and very pervasive today. You might not go to church, or you might not go to church very often, but if you get in a mess, you might look for a pastor, have someone to pray with you, or to find the most spiritual person in your life, or maybe to go to this phone booth and talk to your loved one who died in the tsunami. So you create a ritual. You tap on the box. Now, what's interesting about this word here, and this is brought up in Thomas Holland, The Shadow of the Sword, is that we don't see religions in ourselves. We as human beings have a real hard time seeing ourselves. Our two eyes face outwards, and maybe we see ourselves in a mirror or in a computer screen today, but we see each other more clearly in some ways than we see ourselves, because we don't have all our biases. Well, we do have all our biases when we're seeing other people, but we don't have all our self-serving biases when we see ourselves. What Tom Holland notes when he looks back in history is that this idea of religion, religio, which is Latin to bind, we see it in others. We create religions for others because we only see it in them. Now he's writing here about the 5th century in the Eastern Roman Empire in the relationships with the Jews. Attempts by the imperial elite to spell out precisely what Cristianismo might be had repeatedly led them to define its presumed opposite, Judaismo. Now, what's happening here? Well, you can read in the book of Acts that the first place that Christians were ever called Christians was by non-Christians. The friends and neighbors and rivals and adversaries with which, in the very early church, some of the first Christian believers shared the city of Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas were dispatched by James the Just and the Council of Jerusalem to go up to Antioch because they heard people were freestyling Christianity in all kinds of ways which the Jerusalem Council had not authorized. So let's send up Paul and Barnabas and see what's going on, because the Holy Spirit, this spiritual thing, the Spirit of Jesus had camped on that city, and these people are becoming religion, and are becoming Christian, and they're praying to Christ, and all the stuff is going on, and we don't know what's going on. So we're going to send Paul and Barnabas. This is the first place they're called Christians. Well, what were these people in Antioch doing who were praying to Jesus? They were using the interface to try to live in the world. And they had come under the idea that this name of Jesus and this person that they're connecting to had power, and, well, world life would go better with Jesus. And so then they start gathering, and they're all Jesus fans and interested in this Jesus stuff. So they're finding stuff that's written about Jesus, and they're hearing stories about Jesus, and you heard something about Jesus, and they're all piecing this together. Now, obviously, the Jerusalem Council is hearing this and saying, oh, this has got to be a mess. We got to send someone up there who knows something. Let's send Paul and Barnabas. So they send Paul and Barnabas, and that's where they're called Christians. Well, as Christianity, as we call it, becomes the way of life for more and more in the empire, and as this becomes a tool of empire, well, they've got to get their story straight, because some Christians say Jesus is another God. Some Christians say Jesus was baptized up into God, and so all these questions about who exactly was Jesus, we've got to get this whole thing straightened out. So, of course, Constantine calls a council, and you have all this age of church councils where they have all of these big meetings where they bring in the brightest and the best, and they're going to formulate in propositional forms what exactly is happening, what exactly is true. And if they get all their true stuff, then they'll have their interface ready to go, and now they can sit down and really make the world right. Now again, they can't see their religion. They're just working on the interface. All right? It's the naive picture of ourselves. We just see the truth, and it's attached to all these other things, Jesus and God and the doctrines and the practices and all of those things. That's the interface. But there's those other people that aren't using the interface. What do we call them? We need a name for them. So we got to figure out what Christianity is, and, well, a lot of them are Jews, and so let's call it Judaism, Judaismos. Even at Nicaea, Arians and Catholics had furiously accused each other of being Jews in Christian clothing. Over the subsequent centuries, the same schmear would invariably be applied whenever one faction of the church wished to charge another with heresy. Okay? You're not interfacing with the world correctly. We're going to create a name for you so that we can warn our children about you. As a result, Christians increasingly came to cast the Jewish faith in terms of a religio, of a binding, of a practice. They're bound to these practices. As a result, Christians increasingly came to cast the Jewish faith in terms of a religio that could serve as a mirror of their own. Oh, you have a religion, I have a religion. Mine is different from yours. Now, those differences are important. We're going to name them, and we're going to tribe up, because that's what human beings do, and we're going to see ourselves as rivals and adversaries, and one way or another, we're going to figure out the terms of that conflict. Now, again, the conflicts are not necessarily bad, because conflicts can actually help us see each other, because we can't see things unless we're looking at another. So as a result, Christians increasingly came to cast the Jewish faith in terms of religio that could serve as a mirror of their own. Chauvinistic and desiccated, where Christianity was universal and fire-touched by the Holy Spirit. The Jews themselves, of course, would hardly have recognized this characterization. They're just using the interface too. Nor the presumption of the church that they subscribed to a practiced a religio, a religion called Judaismo, called Judaism. Religio, after all, was a Christian concept, and so too, for that reason, was Judaism. So already we're beginning to see the secular form. That there's, because once you have people here and people there, well, what do? You abstract out the commonality and say this part is the same and these parts are different. Now that you have another layer, well, there's your religion, and this will be practiced again and again. Tom Holland, then later on in his Dellingpod podcast, will talk about that when the British went to India and started looking around and said, wow, their interface is really different. That, and they make connections between certain things. Those are religions. And again, as he noted, the Hindus and many of the people in Asia didn't pick up, and many people in Africa didn't necessarily pick up the interface that the colonialists were using. They picked up some elements of it, but other elements they did very much pick up. Said, ooh, that way of interfacing is good. So very quickly begin to see this differentiation, but this gets really complicated, because how do you know which practice is actually integral? Now, in some ways, we're back to the little girl playing with the puzzle box from the last video. The little girl playing with the puzzle box, she the monkey, in a sense, as a conceptualization, I'm just going to go for the treat. The little girl, you might say, is dumber. Why doesn't she just go for the treat? Well, you assumed what game the little girl should be playing. Maybe the little girl understands that getting the treat is not as important as forming a bond in a relationship with the treat giver. Then why is she tapping on the box? Seems to please the treat giver to tap on the box. It would be a very interesting experiment if, in fact, you had a little puzzle box that the treat giver left, and then see what the little girl does. I don't know if they've done that, and some of you out there in the comment section might know. So what then happens with story? Well, Tom Holland has a very interesting video out there that he got in a lot of trouble for, because he got in a lot of trouble for this book about Islam, because we Christians are used to poking around in these things, and the Islamic world wasn't. So Tom Holland did a documentary on Channel 4. I don't even know if it ever aired on Channel 4. It was so controversial because Tom Holland is basically asking some hard questions about the origin story of Islam. And if you just go on YouTube, and you can very quickly find the origin story of Islam, it's told and retold and retold and retold. That's their origin story. Tom Holland is skeptical about their origin story, and that comes through in this documentary, Islam, the Untold Story. Because one of the things he's looking for is a coin. He's looking for a coin where, basically you begin to see the story, the religion develop. And it's a couple of 100 years after, supposedly, the elements of the story happened in the authorized story. Why did this particular king mint this coin and start moving that story forward? Because stories create empires. Because how do you form bonds between people who do not have blood bonds? You form them in a story. Well, what is that story? In some ways, within that story are clues to the interface. This is how you rule the world. And as their empire is growing, as their empire is succeeding, they now are expressing the will of God. See, Islam is superior to Christianity because Islam has taken the land and the power away from the Christians. Therefore, again, God is the winner of history. And you know the will of God by virtue of God winning history. So history validates the storied will of God. Religious people produce lots of evidence. It's just really broad evidence. What happens, however, when your religious prescriptions don't pan out? And that's what the Jews had to face with the destruction of their temple by the Babylonians and their continual subjugation by empires in the world. And you can watch those transitions happen in the book of Ezekiel, in the Old Testament prophets, and you can watch them happen in the story of Jesus. And you can see me working through some of these issues in some of my sermons lately. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has his Beatitudes, and you can say, well, look at these Beatitudes. There are Beatitudes in the Psalms. Look at the Beatitudes in the Psalms. Beatitudes in the Psalms say, well, God favors those who work the religious interface, and they will succeed and have the favor of God. That's a very religious line. What happens, however, when your temple gets destroyed? Well, the Jews, they keep going. The script was you're supposed to say, the gods of Babylon, Marduk is the great god, we're giving up on the Lord, and we're going to serve Marduk. But the Jews don't. They develop a new story that has Marduk and the Babylonians as not really Marduk, that's where Ezekiel Kaufman gets in. The Babylonians are the servants of God, and God was chastening his people. And Jesus very much continues on that, because when Jesus does his Beatitudes in Matthew 5, they're very strange Beatitudes, because they're not like all the Beatitudes of the Psalms. And again, you can listen to my sermon last week. Jesus doesn't set aside the religious interface. He begins to nuance it. And that nuance of it is, in fact, the cross. Now, these moments of religious dissonance come to us. We're seeing one of these transitions in the nones, N-O-N-E-S. Those who are ditching the religious stories. They're ditching the rituals and the propositions because they're no longer believable. And if you look at the general religious survey, you'll find that a lot of the nuns have grown out of, some of them have grown out of evangelicals, but mostly the mainline movement. Well, what's interesting is that the mainline movement was very much a movement of recruiting God in to fight godless communists. And then when the politics changed, well, now suddenly, our questions are with religious fundamentalists. Well, but again, go back to the conversation about the meaning crisis. People are becoming fundamentalist because of the meaning crisis, because it actually addresses the issues that are beneath the felt tensions. It's a means of certainty. So we have some people ditching fundamentalism. You have other people becoming fundamentalist. So what Jesus actually does is undergoes some very interesting nuance with respect to this question of winners. And in fact, the whole story of Jesus addresses this question of winners, because Jesus both becomes the ultimate loser by being crucified on a cross, and in fact becomes the ultimate victor by beating death via the resurrection. So, as Jonathan Pageau notes many times, Jesus winds up filling out the hierarchy from top to bottom. The greatest among you must be the servant of all, Jesus says. Philippians 2, why is Jesus given the highest place? Because he took on the lowest place. And when Jesus says, when you go into a room, take the lowest seat and let the master of the house promote you to the upper seat. Once you're aware of these status conversations and you read the New Testament, you see that Christianity is engaging in them all the time, because Christianity is trying to modulate the interface to say what happens when you lose. You can see that begun in the book of Job, but you can see it worked through fully in Jesus. Now it runs into trouble again and again when Christians get to the top of the world's hierarchies. And, well, this is what Tom Holland writes about in Dominion. The bottom of the hierarchy keeps coming up and critiquing the top. And you can find that same pattern in René Girard. And that is basically a pattern that is built into Christianity. It's not built into Islam, to the best of my knowledge. But you see that in Christianity. And so this is part of the reason Christianity keeps rumbling through and colonizing different places of the world. It doesn't have to be the winner as such for the interface to continue to be maintained. Point number 5, religion as conceptualization and morality. Now, if you go back to Durkheim, let me get back to that slide. If you go back to Durkheim, a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. There's something at the top of your hierarchy that is creating the hierarchy for everything else. That is to say, things set apart and surrounded by prohibitions. Morality. Beliefs and practices that unite its adherents in a single moral community called a church. All right. Now, Jordan Peterson at Lafayette College in the Mills series was asked, what is religion? Now, again, I've played this clip a number of times. What is religion? And for these clips, again, you can find the videos I'm referring to. They'll be in the show notes below. Well, what is a religion? Religion is what you do. What do you mean what you do? It expresses your underlying axioms. Religion tells you what you should do. Religion is, again, forefronted in pragmatic occasions because how should you act? And we create communities around these moral hierarchies. The other word that we have for this, of course, is morality. Our morality is embedded in a system designed to yield ends that we prefer. Again, if you think of religion as an interface, then morality is how should you operate the interface? And again, this conversation is all over the woke conversations because people are saying, you should say all these certain words. You should do all these certain things. It's a very moralistic religious mode, which is the woke religions. Religion is human. Again, now think of religion as a human authoring system. Think of religion as an interface. But I'm trying to go to that which is good. Good for me, good for you, good for us. Think about Piaget's equilibrated system. Good for not only me now, but me tomorrow and the next day and the next day and every day out. Not only for me, but me and my wife and me and my kids and me and my neighbors and me and the other people at church and me and my city and me and my country, me and the whole, if we conceptualize of humanity as one thing, again, that's another Christian conceptualization, me and all human beings, all right? So there's morality built deep into that, and we're deeply tied in terms of our communities as morality and status. Jonathan Haidt, The Religious Mind, morality binds and blinds. Two of our strongest systems involve status and morality. People hate Donald Trump because they say he is immoral. Immoral according to the moral yardstick that they have. We gain status by signaling to others that we are with them in their moral and religious project, that we are with them with a communal human authoring program, that we are all working the interface together, and if we all work the interface together, then we will achieve the world that we want. You can find this in the work of the Pharisees in the first century. You read about the Pharisees in the New Testament often. The idea was if we can nag and complain the rest of our Jewish friends and neighbors under the Roman occupation to properly wash your hands, observe the tradition of the elders, fast when you're supposed to, observe the Sabbath properly. We'll all work the religious interface together, and then the Lord will finally, as the disciples ask at the beginning of the book of Acts, the Lord will finally restore the kingdom to Israel. Whereas Jesus was, of course, working on a very different project. He was bringing the kingdom to the entire earth. And so right away you see the conceptualization that humanity is my tribe, not just my blood group, not even necessarily just my storied group. Now Jonathan Haidt, what's very interesting is that he has these 6 moral taste buds: care, harm; fairness, cheating; loyalty, betrayal; authority, submission; sanctity, degradation; liberty, oppression. Now, what I think is happening with this new woke system, in his book, The Righteous Mind, he notes that people on the, what he called liberal or progressive end of American politics tend to forefront care, harm. And some of these other values weren't as active in their moral matrix. What I think we see happening in the woke religion are these other values starting to come online. And that's part of the reason why Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle are looking at that and more calling it a religion, because now there's a lot of purity stuff going on in woke culture. There's, all the question about oppression, sanctity and degradation. That's all the purity stuff. Authority and submission. Well, people of color have authority, and the white people should be below. Women have the authority, or gender minorities have the authority, and the cisgenders should be below. And so what, in a sense, you see is that woke religion is filling out Jonathan Haidt's moral taste bud card in terms of their religion. But these moralities, these interfaces, are really something we fight over a lot, because we have a sense that they will only work if we do them together as a community. Again, this gets into Durkheim's idea of the church. And so this is why, in terms of the politics of the now, these fights are so hot and people get so angry and they care so much about it, because we will only stop climate change if we all do this together. We will only stop racism if we all do this together. We will only, let's use Christian terms, we will only honor God if we all do this together. We will only have a great economy if we all do this together. We see our interfaces. We name the interfaces of others because we say, that's the wrong interface. They're doing it wrong. Now, again, in my conversation with Stefan and Kevin, when we're talking about Nietzsche, he pointed out, and quite rightly, that these practices in some ways outlast the propositional accents. Jordan Peterson pointed out that we put up Christmas trees and we have no idea why. It just feels right. Jonathan Peugeot has built a good channel on, explaining the roots of all of these symbolisms that we practice. And then suddenly we become aware of them propositionally, consciously. Well, we find that appealing because, in a sense, once we become aware of them propositionally and consciously, now we have the ability to manipulate them and address them and take hold of them. But Nietzsche was right that God was embedded in our actions. And when we killed merely that surface layer of the chatty rider, thinking of the Jonathan Haidt's elephant in the rider, we kill the chatty rider. The elephant is still deeply religious. But now what's the relationship between the different layers, between the practices and the beliefs, and especially the morality? Because, again, I would argue that in many ways, the culture war that the United States is in is a Christendom civil war. That as Tom Holland has pointed out many times, the moral substructure, the moral values at play often between Sam Harris and Christians that Sam Harris is debating. Sam Harris is using the morality of the Bible to complain about Christians and the Bible. Well, how do these layers interact? Well, one of the things that I pointed out, I know there were sound issues in that video, was that generally speaking, ancient peoples asked in religion and morality, how can we conform to nature? Okay? As if we conform to nature, our lives will be better. That's our duty. That's our ought. In many ways today, modern people say, how can we bend nature to our will? How can we colonize nature and have nature submit to our demands and our desires? The difficulty that we keep running into is that, well, you have the moral yardstick problem. Where do you find your moral yardstick? And is nature your host, or is nature your area of colonizing? Because what we see is today we have all of these different interesting things. Well, we have all of these diets, and we want our diets to be more natural. Well, it was pretty natural for us to die of predation by snakes and lions and tigers. That part of nature we're not very interested in. We're more interested in saying, well, we want to eat these foods and eat and not eat those foods, and we should live this certain way and not that certain way. But other aspects of nature we're clearly not interested in. So again, we've sort of established an interface. So you've got this question of nature, but you've also got this question of the metadivine realm and theism. And what's interesting with Nietzsche is that Nietzsche is very much on the metadivine realm side of things, not the theism sides of things, but he's also sort of pivoting over the ancient to the modern. And so what he's saying is we need to colonize the world. And so he has a sharp critique against Christianity, that it's a slave religion, that Christianity, basically exalts the weak. And that's not very natural, so we need to get back to the natural, and our will should dominate. But we have all of these questions. Where do our wills come from? Where can we know the good? How can we know the good? All of this is built into religion. So we're looking to nature alone to discover what is. That throws us back on the Hitler questions. Are we not part of nature? Are we looking at the question this way? When we're looking at the question this way, we've already embedded within it the Genesis Imago Dei, that we ourselves are trying to colonize nature, because humanity in the Genesis story, we're this stuff of earth, the man formed out of the clay, and the breath of heaven. The breath of the God poured into us. Human beings are intermediaries between heaven and earth. Our life is a story that does not decay, lived out and created by bodies that do decay. And so in this middle point, we want to both colonize nature and be subject to nature, and those things don't work. And that sets up all sorts of Pageauian conflicts that Jonathan Pageau is so good at sort of teasing out and putting before our eyes so that we can see them. Nature won't tell you what is good. Your instincts will, but there, as C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, your instincts will tell you many things. Your instincts have trouble in terms of dealing with a hierarchy. Well, my instinct now, if I'm hungry, I want food. If I'm horny, I want sex. If I'm feeling weak, I want power. If I'm wet, I want dry. If I'm dirty, I want wet. It's just on and on and on. And your instincts, they have a serious time problem because, again, our minds, we have eternity built into us. Our minds are living this eternal story while our bodies are living right now in the moment in a very complex physical world. And so Tom Holland comes around and says, surprise, we're deeply Christian. And this really bothers the rider Christians. Now, the rider on the elephant, because they're busy pointing out the religious deficiencies of everyone else. And again, Tom Holland in the Shadow of the Sword talking about the fact that, in these church councils, you're calling other Christians Jews, and then you're saying, well, Jews, that's Judaism. We have a name for that. What's the name for me? Truth, the real interface, the way the world really is. Of course, all of us think the way the world really is, because if we thought something different, we would change our mind. That's simply the way we worked. So we're Christians. We're deeply Christian. This bothers the atheists. They've been busy pointing out the moral deficiencies in Christians and their religion while using the moral yardstick of Christianity to do so. And Tom Holland and Rene Girard love pointing this out. The question that is bothering everyone is, will the moral intuitions endure when the practices recede? Now, just today I got a tweet from someone asking if I knew the work of James Smith, and I know it somewhat. I haven't really done a deep dive into it. I suppose I could do it in terms of my videos, but I sort of follow my salience muse, used to borrow a Greek term, and I kind of ramble along as I ramble on to things. And watch how practice is kept back into our anxious vocabulary. You see it all over John Vervaeke's work. You see it all over Drew Johnson's work. You see it all over James K. Smith's work. When you look at the conversation that I did with my friend, the church planter in Davis, he talks about the fact when he first started doing this work, if someone started snooping around his church and became interested in Christianity, he was always looking for the best book to give him to change his thinking. Now, he wants the person to come to church to change his practice. If you go to a yoga studio in just about any place in the US or Canada, all they will talk about is the practice. Because what we're trying to do is to colonize our minds by colonizing our body, and we recognize some of what Jonathan Haidt had pointed out, that you don't change the elephant by talking to it, you change the elephant by changing the path. And the path is the practice. And so now you find this it's very hot right now in Christianity in a way that it wasn't hot 20 years ago. And in fact, you'll find that deep in the Jordan Peterson canon. His first biblical series, he talked about, first we act it out, and then we represent it in our acting out, and then we abstract it, and then we represent it in our abstractions. And thinking about God, that's the abstraction. That's the image of the totality. God is a big part of the interface that we're trying to use. And it's such a handy element of the interface that to go without it might, in fact, be a really bad idea. But we don't know that because there's 2, 3, 4 generations of living without it, and by the time you get to the end of it, you realize, maybe we shouldn't have left that behind. And this is some of what I talked about, Kevin, that if you grew up in the church and then you sort of walked away from it as a smart 13-year-old atheist, and then suddenly in your 30s you're looking around listening to Jordan Peterson and say, I want to believe in God again. You had all that stuff built into you when you, in your first 10 years of life, that it's easy to feel God once more. But if you didn't have that, it's a long, steep curve of practice to try and get that into your emotional feelings. Because just as every now and then, when my boys were in high school living at home, they had a PS3 and they had these little controllers and they were operating these little representational characters and all kinds of different video games. And boy, their thumbs would go on their thumbs. And then when I tried to play these things, it was horrible. Killed me every time. I don't know how to work a controller, but they're little young minds and brains, boy. They programmed this stuff into themselves. That brain plasticity, wow, worked well. Try and learn a language after the age of 25. Try and learn a video game after the age of 25. What you realize is that, well, the cake gets baked. And if you didn't get religion young, just like if you didn't get language young and you didn't get game controllers young, it's hard to fully inhabit the thing. It's hard to really work the interface if you weren't brought up in it. Now, I think I covered this in a previous slide. Just today on Twitter, Jonathan Peugeot had a tweet basically about what Jonathan Peugeot and I have been working in the last 2-3 years with the whole Jordan Peterson business, starting meetups. We've had a lot of people want to join the Orthodox Church, and for me, it's been fascinating for me to watch because, why orthodoxy? Well, it's an intuitive and symbolic. You've got the icons, you've got the images. To go into an Orthodox church is a much more religiously storified, embedded experience than to go into a plain Protestant church. What's amazing is that in the 1980s and 90s, and the run-up of the seeker movement to try to arrest the ongoing secularization, Bill Hybels and others created church in buildings that looked like junior college campuses, plain auditoriums. And the language in the seeker movement was to create, and this is so ironic given where the culture has gone, to create a safe place to hear a dangerous message. Well, that's interesting. Why? Because if you had a lot of, at least for the boomers, smells and bells and the religion, dismissed that. So then you bring them into a very sparse hall and you give them the kind of music they're used to listening to, but now with Christian words, and you give them a message that is geared towards, one of the interesting aspects of the seeker movement was wisdom. Every seeker sermon was from the Psalms or the prophets or the Proverbs, because you would create credibility by affording them wisdom that worked in life, and then they would buy the religious thing that you really wanted them to buy, which was to pray the sinner's prayer and be loyal to your religious tribe. That's how the seeker movement worked. Well, Orthodoxy is taking a very different movement. Orthodoxy is addressing people that aren't running away from religion, but running to it. It's intuitive and symbolic, and there's Jesus up at the top of the dome. And here are all the icons, all the different walls. And as Jonathan says, it doesn't matter how good your pastor is. You're going through the liturgy, and you're working the practice, and you're doing the kneeling, and you're doing all of these things. You're physically being embedded into the religion. You're learning the interface, just like I'm trying to learn this silly controller so I can just have my dude run around, and my kids either bump me off with their go-karts or stab me and, or shoot me down or whatever. I lose every time because I can't keep up with them. So you have to really get embedded in it. It's ancient, but in America, it's new. So you have immigrants coming to America. It's the same old church thing. The icons and the Jesus and the liturgy. You've had it memorized for generations, yada, yada, yada. But for Americans coming in, there's like, oh, wow, look at the art, look at the liturgy, look at the vestments, look at the incense, look at the ritual, all of the signals being given that this is holy, this is sacred, this is true, this is right. It's being knitted back into them. Ritual and practice. It's full of threskeia, trembling, awe, wonder, therapy, becoming truly human. Jordan Peterson was a gateway to this. So what is religion? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is what Jesus says. This is the interface. Love your neighbor as yourself. But the ironic interface of Jesus is, this will probably kill you. Remember what God is again. God number one and God number two got divorced in the subtraction story. We forgot that God, and this is in many ways what Jordan Peterson sort of schooled the world in, what we forgot was that God is this interface representation that deals with what is too big for us to deal with. And that the interface goes down into winners and losers and all the various ways that we interact with our world. It's God number one. But God number two, as C.S. Lewis points out, is personal, an agent, has a will. And therefore, it's not just a matter of, well, there's this meta-divine realm and we're trying to live our best life now. It's a matter of, well, you're living in the midst of a drama with eternal consequence, and you're not just having to learn a whole bunch of rules, but you have to, in fact, deal with a person, which, as any of you know, having dealt with people, is far more complex. People are the most challenging elements of our environment that we have to deal with, both ourselves as people and others as people. As a pastor, people come in and they don't necessarily just want to talk to me about their plumbing. They want to talk to me about their parents or their children or their husbands or their wives or all of these things, because the people are so utterly complex and they tax us, and we're looking for an interface in order to interrelate with the people. So what is religion? Whoops. Lost my thing here. What is religion? Well, number one, religion, first of all, is, well, it's a religion, as Joe Rogan, but they're growing out of it, and you can watch them growing out of it. 2, religion as a human authoring program, quite a bit deeper. 3, religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to the sacred, and it creates a moral community, a community of practice that intends to interface with the world. Religion is, I missed 4 there. Religion as adaptive culture. God shows the winners. People learn to work their boxes. Their ritual's not simply for the gummy bears. It's built into us being a human being. And 5, religion as conceptualization and morality as this interface. And again, wokeness is probably filling out the Jonathan Haidt card. I have no idea how long this was. Plenty long, it looks like. So, hope it makes some sense.